In 2005, a 29-year-old woman walked into a police station in Alaska and told one of the most chilling stories the authorities had ever heard. She and her 14 brothers and sisters had been brainwashed, tormented, abused in every way imaginable, and held captive in their own home for decades. And the monster behind it all was her own father, a man known to the locals as Papa Pilgrim. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Sommer Sanchez, and on this channel we talk about crime, cults, and heinous history. So if that sounds interesting to you, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you never miss an upload. Today we are talking about a man named Robert Hale, also known as Papa Pilgrim, and how he essentially turned his family into a cult. Before we get into today's case, I'd like to thank Wild for partnering with me for this video. Wild is a company that creates great smelling deodorants and body washes using natural ingredients, and they come in these really nice reusable containers. So you're not only using high quality products, but you're also helping out the environment. The Wild deodorants come in these reusable aluminum cases, and the cases are actually really good quality. I also really like that you can personalize your case. You get to choose a color and they also put your name on it. And of course I chose a green case because that's my favorite color. I made the switch to Wild specifically because of the reusable cases. I try to make environmentally friendly choices where I can, but I never really thought that I could do that with my deodorant. And because Wild uses reusable containers, they've managed to save more than 200 tons of single-use plastics from landfills. That's a lot of plastic. All of the Wild products are created with natural ingredients, and they never contain any aluminum salts, parabens, or sulfates, and they are certified vegan and cruelty-free. And all of their formulas are designed to be gentle on the skin. I think I've liked pretty much every scent that I've tried from Wild so far, but my favorite has to be this one, which is the linen and lilac. It smells really, really good. It's got like just a clean, fresh smell, and it's not overpowering. And the deodorants are very effective. I don't have to keep reapplying throughout the day. The refills are super simple to put in. You just press the buttons on the side of your case and you pull out the little holder, pop your refill onto the top of the holder, and then slip it back in the case. And Wild also offers a subscription service that's very flexible. You can decide how often you receive your refills, and you can like mix and match scents so you can figure out which one you like best. Click my link in the description box or scan the QR code on the screen and use my code Sommer Sanchez at checkout to get 20% off with Wild. And that discount code does not last long, so go ahead and click that link to learn more about Wild's products and their mission. Thanks again to Wild for partnering with me on this video, and now let's jump into the case. Robert Allen Hale was born on April 7th, 1941 in Fort Worth, Texas, and he was actually a twin. His twin brother's name was Billy, and everyone called Robert Bobby, but I'm just going to call him Robert. So Robert was one of 3 boys born to Virginia Kingsbury and I.B. Hale. And if there are any college football historians watching, you'll probably recognize the name I.B. Hale. I.B. Hale became a Texas legend when he was playing college football for TCU, Texas Christian University, back in the 1930s. He was even inducted into the Texas Sports Hall of Fame in 1985, and he was a first-round draft pick for the Washington Commanders back in 1939. He ended up passing on that opportunity, though, to pursue a dream of working for the FBI. And he actually lived out that dream, and he became an FBI agent, and he moved up the ranks, and he even became really close with J. Edgar Hoover. And because of this prestigious job as an FBI agent, the Hale family were very well off. They lived in one of the nicest areas of Fort Worth, and their kids attended very affluent schools. IB and Virginia were very religious, they were very conservative, and they expected their kids to behave a certain way. And over the years, it became harder and harder for them to control Robert in particular. When Robert was only 10 years old, he and his brother Billy beat up a kid. This kid had been bullying some of the kids in the neighborhood, and so one day Robert and Billy had enough, and they caught the kid and they beat the shit out of him. And after that day, Robert realized that he got results using violence to solve his problems. He was an angry kid, he was an aggressive kid, and when he got into his teens, he ended up taking boxing lessons, and he was actually pretty good. He was strong, and he definitely had the aggression for boxing, and he learned to solve all of his problems with violence. He and his brothers attended Arlington Heights High School, and I'm not sure what this high school is like today, but back then it was like the school for the children of the local elite. Most of the parents of the kids who were attending Arlington Heights were like doctors, lawyers, engineers, FBI agents, political figures. Lots of very privileged kids attended this school. And when Robert was a senior in high school, he met a 15-year-old girl named Kathleen Connolly, who everyone called KK. KK Connolly was the daughter of John Connolly, and John Connolly would go on to become the governor of Texas, but at this point he was a lawyer. He is also known as one of the people who was in the car with JFK when he was assassinated in 1963. John Connolly was actually wounded himself that day, but he ended up making a full recovery. And it turns out that Lee Harvey Oswald, the man who was arrested for the assassination, he had actually been a student at Arlington Heights High School, the same school that Robert Hill had attended, and he was only 1 year above Robert. But this is the type of people that Robert Hill was surrounded by. He had a very high society, privileged life, and he knew it, and he was very arrogant about his family's status. There was one time that he and his friends were just, driving around, and they spotted a police officer, and Robert bet his friends that he could speed past the police officer and he wouldn't get a ticket because he was the great I.B. Hill's son. And he was actually right. He sped right past the officer. The officer pulled him over, asked for his license, which Robert handed to him, and then casually mentioned that his father was I.B. Hill. And the officer let him go with a warning. So like I said, Robert meets John Connolly's daughter, KK, in high school, and KK was only 15. She was a sophomore, and Robert was a senior, and he was 17 at the time, and they started dating. They started a relationship. And right after KK turned 16, she found out that she was pregnant. Now, this was back in the 50s. This would have been pretty scandalous at the time, especially because Robert and KK were the kids of very prominent people in the community. So instead of telling their parents about the pregnancy, they ran off together and they eloped in Oklahoma. Back then, and maybe even still today, I don't know, you could get married in Oklahoma without your parents' consent at the age of 16. And Robert knew this, and he convinced KK to elope with him. And he promised her this wonderful life in Florida. He knew someone that worked down in Florida, and he thought that this person maybe could give him a job. And so he was telling KK, we're going to start this really great life. We're going to raise our baby together, and we're going to create this happy little home together. But KK would actually be dead just 44 days after she married Robert Hill. So Robert and KK got married in a secret ceremony in Ardmore, Oklahoma on March 16th, 1959. And then after the wedding, they headed down to Tallahassee, Florida to start their new lives. Robert knew someone in Tallahassee, and he owned a boat rental business. And so he gave Robert a job. KK got a job working as a clerk at a dime store, and they moved into this small upstairs apartment. But the honeymoon ended pretty much right after it began. Robert was possessive, he was aggressive, and it's not really known exactly what happened between Robert and KK, but she very quickly became afraid of Robert. KK ran away from the apartment on more than one occasion. She would go hide out in hotel rooms, just trying to escape Robert, but he always managed to track her down and convince her to come back. And just keep in mind that KK is only 16 years old and she's pregnant, and she is really starting to regret this decision to marry Robert. She ended up sneaking out of the apartment one day, and she found a payphone, and she called her father to tell him where she was and to confess that she was pregnant. And KK's dad told her, it's okay, just come home and we will figure it out. Everything will be okay. But by the end of that conversation, KK had pretty much talked herself out of going home, and she decided to stay. And not long after that phone call, KK was dead. So the day before KK died, she and Robert had a really bad argument. And it was so bad, in fact, that after Robert left for work, KK went downstairs to the landlady's apartment and she hid out that night. The landlady would later say that KK was obviously very afraid of Robert. The next morning, KK went straight down to the police station, and she told an officer that she really wanted to go home. She wanted to go back to Texas to be with her family. But before the police could help her, before they could contact her parents, before they could do anything, she suddenly changed her mind and she walked out of the police station, and she was dead just a few hours later. Now, what actually happened after KK returned home isn't known really, because there were only two people present that day, Robert and KK. And KK is dead, and so the only version of events we have comes from Robert. So in his version of the story, he arrived home that day, he had been running some errands, and he walked into the apartment and discovered that KK had come back home while he was out. And she was sitting on the couch with a 20 gauge shotgun aimed right at the side of her head. Robert said that KK told him that she thought he didn't love her anymore, and she just couldn't go on living like this, and she just wanted to end it all. Robert said that he pleaded and begged her not to hurt herself. He said he lunged towards her to grab the shotgun just as he saw her pressing down on the trigger, but the gun went off and KK ended up being shot once in the side of the head behind her right ear. The neighbors, of course, they heard all of this commotion, and so they called the police, By the time the police arrived, KK was still alive, but she was just barely hanging on. So they loaded her up into the ambulance to rush her to the hospital, but sadly she didn't make it, and she ended up dying on her way to the hospital. Now, Robert was hysterical when police arrived. At one point, after KK was loaded into the ambulance, he actually tried to jump out of the second-story apartment window, and they ended up having to give Robert medication to keep him calm because he was just absolutely inconsolable. He definitely seemed like a grieving spouse, but some of Robert's story just doesn't make sense. First of all, KK had been a really happy, outgoing girl before she married Robert. She also had an open invitation to go back home. Her family already knew about the baby. They knew that she and Robert had gotten married, so she wasn't hiding that anymore. And her dad said it was okay, just come home. She knew that that was an option. And it does sound like the marriage was absolutely terrible from the start, but would that alone be enough to drive KK to end her life and the life of her unborn baby? Also, a shotgun is probably not the easiest weapon to use in a suicide. KK would have had to hold the shotgun in a very awkward way. Correct me if I'm wrong on this because I don't know anything about guns, but I would think that it would be hard for her to reach the trigger. And KK's fingerprints were never found on the shotgun. A coroner's inquest was conducted and Robert told his version of the story, and he played the part of the grieving husband very, very well. He was also given a polygraph test and he passed. Now, I.B. Hale did come down to Florida and he was present for a lot of like the questioning and maybe even the inquest stuff. I'm not really sure. So did his fame once again help his son get out of trouble? We can't say for sure, but Robert did end up being cleared and he was released from custody and he was free to live out the rest of his life. KK's death was ruled an accident or a potential suicide. But by the time Robert returned home to Fort Worth, people were talking. Everyone had heard about KK's death and some people were not buying Robert's story. They didn't believe it was an accident and they did not believe that KK took her own life. And so Robert was getting some sideways glances from a lot of the kids back home. And this part is really suspicious to me. Apparently, in the weeks after KK's death, after Robert had already returned home to Fort Worth, he ended up traveling back to Tallahassee on 2 separate occasions to talk to the ambulance driver, the one who was driving when KK died on the way to the hospital. But like, why? What reason would he have to go and talk to the ambulance driver? Not just once, but twice. Was he trying to see if KK managed to say anything incriminating before she died? And there are a lot of people that believe that Robert Hale murdered his wife that day, especially once this case broke and people saw what a monster he really was. But Robert picked up the pieces and he went on with his life. He couldn't bring himself to return to Arlington Heights High School though, with all of the gossip going around the school about KK's death. So he ended up getting his GED and then he attended TCU, Texas Christian University, the same school his dad had attended, but college just wasn't for him and he ended up dropping out. He spent the next several years traveling around various states, really taking to the hippie movement that was happening at the time. He was hopping from one encampment to the next, doing lots of drugs, mostly LSD, and living the free love type of life, having sex with lots of different people. According to one of Robert's daughters, he was a Satan worshiper around this time. And it has been said that he ran in the same social circle as Charles Manson. During his travels, he ended up fathering at least 3 kids by 2 different women, but he did not have a relationship with any of those kids. Then when Robert was 33 years old, he landed in a commune in the middle of the Mojave Desert, and this is where he met the girl who would go on to have 15 of his children. And I say girl because she was only 16 years old when she met Robert, and he was 33. Her name was Karina Rose Bressler, and Robert would call her Country Rose. So Rose was the daughter of a Hollywood actress named Betty Bressler, later known as Betty Freeman. Rose's dad was a photographer named Dan Bressler, and Rose's mother Betty and Dan divorced when Rose was only 3. After the divorce, she was mostly raised by her grandmother until she hit her teenage years, and then she moved in with her mother. At that point, though, her mom had gotten remarried, her life was a lot different, and she really didn't like living in Beverly Hills. She just didn't feel like she fit in. So she ran away and she joined in the hippie movement, and she landed in that commune in the Mojave Desert, the same commune that Robert Hale stumbled into. And Robert wasted no time in grooming Rose and taking advantage of the huge age and maturity gap between the two of them. He was more than twice Rose's age. They were 17 years apart. They didn't legally get married at this time, but they did legally change their names to Firefly and Sunlight Sunstar. Robert was Firefly and Rose was Sunlight. And this would just be the beginning of years and years of brainwashing and abuse. Robert was a terrible person and he had a lot of personality flaws, but one of the most alarming, and the one that would just get worse and worse over the years and lead to so much pain and suffering for his family, was this idea he had that he was the most important person in the world. He was a narcissist through and through. He was the most self-centered person. He acted as if he were the king and the people in his life were just peasants living in his kingdom. And because Rose was so young and vulnerable, and she was very easily taken advantage of by someone like Robert, she came to view him as her leader, her ruler. Robert demanded sex all the time. He always had his hands all over Rose, and she couldn't escape it. And even when Rose didn't want to have sex with him, she felt like she couldn't say no, so she would just let him do whatever he wanted to her. Robert even started making Rose have sex with other men and also other women. He was very good at convincing people to do things that they didn't want to do. He had a way about him where he could command a room, he could command a conversation, and when he spoke, people really listened. So, like most cult leaders, he had that charm and charisma about him, and he knew exactly how to use it to take advantage of people. On January 23rd, 1974, the first of Robert and Rose's 15 children was born. I forgot to mention this earlier, but Robert was a midwife. During his years roaming around like in and out of communes, he became known as the go-to guy if someone was in labor. So when Rose went into labor, they didn't go to a hospital. Rose gave birth right there in the commune with Robert as her midwife. Robert actually chewed through the umbilical cord after the birth, and they didn't have a scale to weigh the baby. So a couple of days after the birth, Robert and Rose went to a grocery store and they set the baby into one of those like little produce scales so they could get her weight. And now they had this brand new baby girl, and they named her Butterfly Sunstar. Later on, they changed her name to Elizabeth, and then they changed her name again to Alisha. And Alisha is her name throughout most of the story, and that's actually what she still goes by to this day. So that's what I'm going to call her. And Alisha is a very, very important person in this case. She became the person that Robert tortured and abused the most out of everyone else in his life. The things that he did to Alisha are absolutely horrific, but it would be Alisha who would eventually cause her father's downfall. Unfortunately, though, it would take 30 years before that day finally came. So about 18 months after Alisha was born, Robert and Rose have another child, a baby boy that they named Joseph. And this is around the time that Robert really started to ramp up his control and abuse. Robert became very controlling over Rose and the kids. Rose basically lived to serve Robert at this point. She was around to fulfill his needs. And to make matters worse, the family was essentially living in poverty, and they were still like in and out of various encampments and communes, so they really didn't have anywhere to call home. And Robert was still doing lots and lots of drugs, and he was drinking lots and lots of alcohol. There was one night when Robert and Rose were sitting around a campfire with the kids. They were all naked, actually, and Rose was nursing Joseph, and she and Robert started arguing about something. And Robert got so angry that he slung hot coals at Rose, who was holding the baby, and Alisha was sitting right next to her, and one of the hot coals landed on Alicia's leg, and she actually still has the scar to this day. Then one day, Robert got the idea to go see his twin brother Billy in Fort Worth. Billy had taken a much different path in life than Robert had. Billy had stayed in college, he became a veterinarian, he had a successful practice in the Fort Worth area, he lived in a really nice house with his wife and kids, and so Robert decided to go visit him. He hadn't seen him in years, and so he packed up his family and they all drove to Texas to go visit Billy and his family. And during this visit, Billy invited Robert and his family to join him and his family for their Sunday church services. But this one Sunday church service was enough to completely change his entire way of thinking. It changed his entire life. And unfortunately, this would be a change for the absolute worst. As Robert was sitting in the church listening to the preacher's sermon, he became completely entranced. He was so moved by this service that he even started crying. And at the point in the church service where the preacher says, to come up to the front if you want to be saved, Robert did not hesitate to walk up to the front of the church and asked to be saved. And that was it. After that day, Robert became obsessed with learning anything and everything he could about God's word. He pored over the Bible, he picked it apart line by line, he made his own interpretations of the scriptures. He was well on his way to becoming a cult leader. And of course, he pulled his family into this newfound love for Christianity and God and the Bible. And once Robert found religion, he decided that he should go to some of the communes that he had stayed in over the years and preach to everyone and try try to get people to convert to Christianity. And so he did this. He and his family went around to different communes, and Robert would preach and he would talk to people about the word of God and the Bible and stuff. And he actually did convert some people and he gained a little following. Robert became very fanatical very quickly. He started telling his family and his followers that they needed to get off the grid. They needed to find a secluded place to live. They needed to go somewhere where they could live this totally pure life. He wanted to take his family and his people away from the evils of the outside world. And then one day he saw a flyer advertising a job as a caretaker for some property in New Mexico. This property was located in the Rocky Mountains of New Mexico in a place called Mora, and this place would get snowed in every winter. There would be no way to get onto the property or out of the property during winter, so whoever was chosen for this caretaker position needed to be prepared to be cut off completely from the outside world for long stretches of time. And this, of course, was exactly what Robert was looking for. This job would be perfect for Robert and his family and his followers. Finally, they could live in isolation away from the evil world. So Robert, Rose, Alisha, and Joseph, along with a handful of people from the communes that Robert had converted, they all headed to this property in the Rocky Mountains of New Mexico. And they later found out that the owner of that property was Jack Nicholson, like the Jack Nicholson, the actor, star of The Shining, the Joker from Batman, and one of my personal favorites, Mars Attacks. Jack Nicholson didn't live on the property, of course, so he needed someone to stay there and take care of the land. So Robert and his family, they got the job, and he and his followers, they started settling on the land. They dug a well so that they would have a water supply. They built some pretty primitive little structures. They were really poorly insulated, and that's where the followers would stay. And Robert and his family would live in the main house, which was also super small. It was just like this tiny little cabin. But as soon as winter started to roll in, the followers were like, you know what? This is a bad idea. We are not properly prepared for this insane winter weather that we've been warned about, so we're just going to go ahead and leave. And Robert was totally fine with this because to him, it was more important that he and Rose have as many kids as possible, and he wanted to live like they lived in the old days, in the pioneer days. He wanted to grow his own food, have his own farm animals, and most importantly, he wanted to hide his family away from the rest of the world. And that's exactly what they did. For 20 years, they lived on this property, isolated in the middle of the New Mexico Rockies. And more babies came over the years. Rose actually had a baby every 2 years for 30 years. And all of these children, along with Rose, became Robert's punching bags, his pawns, his hostages. So this little house that they lived in, the main house, it was less than 400 square feet. So we are talking tiny, super tight living quarters. There was no running water. There was no electricity. The house had 2 beds, a small kitchen, a workbench, and a little living room with a fireplace. There was no bathroom in the house, and there wasn't even an outhouse. Robert found an old camper toilet and he set it down in the living room right next to the only chair in the house, which was his chair. And that's where everyone went to the bathroom, right out in the open in front of everyone. And they didn't have toilet paper either. Instead of toilet paper, they used old pieces of clothing, like an old t-shirt. And this was a shared t-shirt. Over the course of the day, this little camper toilet, it would get filled. I mean, there were a lot of people living in this house. And so Robert would take it out, he'd dump it, and then he'd bring it back in. But by the time that Alisha was 6 years old, it became her job to dump out that toilet. She was 6 years old. And as part of their pioneer living, the family did not watch TV. They didn't even own a TV. They did not attend school. They were homeschooled by Robert and Rose, but they weren't actually taught anything. These kids were not taught how to read, write. They weren't taught even basic math. This schooling mostly just involved learning survival skills, learning how to make a fire, how to make fresh water, how to skin a deer, stuff like that. They weren't taught any form of academics. A few of the older kids, including Alisha, did learn to read a little bit, mostly from reading the Bible with Robert, but they couldn't read or write fluently. Robert only allowed 2 books in the house, and that was the Bible and a book called Pilgrim's Progress, written by John Bunyan in the 1600s. Robert also started making everyone call him Papa because he said that's what Jesus called his father, so that's what they were to call him. But the locals knew him as Papa Pilgrim. The kids were expected to do pretty much all of the chores. They cared for the animals, they built things, they cleaned stuff, they helped with the cooking, and Robert wouldn't allow the kids to eat until all of their chores were done. But they couldn't start their chores for the day until they listened to Robert preach and read from his Bible. And this would go on sometimes for hours. And Robert would be served his breakfast and he would eat while he was preaching preaching, and the kids would just have to sit there and watch Robert eat, and they couldn't have anything. He would be eating these great big hearty meals of like eggs and bacon and stuff while his kids went hungry and sat at his feet and listened to him drone on and on. Then once he was finally done preaching, the kids would be allowed to start their chores. This included taking the goats out on the mountain, milking the cows, collecting eggs, tending to the garden, and this would sometimes take hours. Sometimes the chores wouldn't be done until it was already dark outside, and the kids still hadn't been allowed to eat. Then once the chores were finally done, the kids would come in totally exhausted, and they would sit down ready to have some food, but they weren't allowed to eat until Robert took his first bite. So they would all just be sitting at the table looking at their plates, wanting so badly to take a bite, but they would just stare at Robert and wait until he finally took his first bite, and then they knew they could eat. And sometimes the kids would fall asleep right there at the table before they had even eaten because they were so exhausted. And Alisha would try to wake them up because she was so afraid that they would starve, because if they fell asleep, they would have to wake up and repeat this process all over again the next day, and they wouldn't have a chance to eat again until the next night. The kids were only allowed to bathe once every 3 or 4 days, but Robert loved nice hot baths, and he would take baths all the time. The kids would have to fill up his tub with water, and they would build a little fire under the tub so it would heat up the water, and Robert would sit in the bath for hours and hours just relaxing while his children were forced to stay dirty. And then on the days where the kids were actually allowed to take a bath, Robert would take his bath first, and then the kids would have to bathe in Robert's dirty bath water. And they weren't allowed to even take their clothes off to bathe. They had to remain dressed while they bathed. Robert told them that it was a sin to see other people naked. You couldn't even see your own self naked. You were sinning if you saw your own nakedness. And so everyone was forced to bathe with their clothes on. And when Robert would give his daily sermons, if he thought that one of the kids wasn't listening, he would ask them to repeat what he had just said. And if they couldn't repeat exactly what he had just said, they would be brutally beaten. Robert would beat the kids all the time. He would use a leather belt. He even had this long, like, leather whip that he would use. He would also have them go outside to pick their own willow switch, and he would hit them with switches. And Robert would be holding his Bible with one hand, reading from it as he was beating his children with the other hand. And then after he was done beating his children, they had to thank him for correcting them. That's what he called it. He called it correction, not abuse, correction. The kids would be beaten for anything and everything. If they were in charge of milking the cows and the cow kicked the bucket over or something, the kids would be terrified to go back home because they knew what was going to happen. They would be crying as they were walking back into the house because they knew that they were going to be severely beaten by Robert because the cow kicked over the milk bucket. And over the years, Robert is just growing more and more fanatical about religion, his own form of twisted religion. And eventually he had the family convinced that he had a direct link to God. He convinced them that he was a prophet and that God was talking to him. God was guiding him, specifically giving him direction. And he drilled it into his kids' heads that if they went against him, they were going against God. And if they were against God, then they were going to burn for all eternity. Just your classic cult leader bullshit. And Rose was being abused as well. She was a victim too, and she felt completely helpless. And she watched as her children were beaten down emotionally and physically by Robert. Robert would psychologically terrorize his children as well. And just a warning, this next thing involves a dog. So just going to throw that out there. I almost didn't even include this next thing in the video, but I really want you to understand just how sadistic and fucked up this man was. So the kids didn't have any friends, right? They were isolated on this property. They were kept away from outsiders. They didn't go to school. So they only had each other, and they also had a Saint Bernard, and his name was Mountain. Mountain was the sweetest dog. He was like this huge teddy bear. He would follow the kids around everywhere. He would let them climb all over him, run around with them, and cuddle with them. Mountain was a member of the family. He was their best friend. Then one day, Mountain died, and the kids were absolutely devastated. But instead of consoling his kids, maybe have a funeral for Mountain, Robert forced his kids to watch as he strung Mountain's body up from a tree and skinned him. And he used Mountain's hide as a rug for their attic. And when the kids would misbehave, they would be forced to go sit on top of Mountain's hide. When Alisha was like 7 or 8 years old, she got in trouble for something. And as punishment, Robert locked her in the attic and made her lay on top of Mountain for over a week. She was forced to lay on her dead dog's hide for days. And she was barely fed the entire time she was locked in the attic. Her mom would bring her like scraps of food and water and stuff, but that was it. And she wasn't even allowed to use the little camper toilet in the living room. She was given a metal bucket to use, and she had to ask permission to go to the bathroom. So anytime she needed to go to the bathroom in the bucket, she would have to call down to her father to ask if it was okay. And every time she did this, Robert would come upstairs into the attic and beat her. So Alisha would just try to hold it as long as she possibly could, because she knew that she was going to have to suffer before she could go to the bathroom. And the only reason why Alisha was finally let out of the attic was because Robert thought that someone had called CPS on them, so he let her out just in case. The children were also told that their dolls and their toys were evil, that they were idols, that they were possessed. So Robert made all of his kids collect their toys, and Robert made them destroy their toys. Alisha had one toy to her name, and it was a doll named Betty, and she loved this doll. She took it everywhere with her. She slept with it, and Robert started telling her that her doll was evil. It was possessed, which to a child, that would have been so traumatic. And he made Alisha throw her doll away. Her one and only comforting thing in the whole wide world. She had to get rid of it. And not just get rid of it, she was made to feel guilty for being sad because the doll was evil. So why would you care so much about an evil doll? Robert also told his kids that it was forbidden for them to play pretend. You shouldn't play pretend because it was a form of witchcraft or something. I actually can't remember what stupid thing he said, but he told the kids that it was a sin for them to be pretending. He said it was evil and that he better never catch them playing pretend again, which was devastating because they didn't have TV, they didn't have computers, they didn't have toys now. So all they ever did was play pretend. All of the children had developed these really vivid imaginations because that's all they had. Their lives were reduced to doing chores, listening to Robert read the Bible, and tending to their father's every need. And if the family ever went out in public, because they did have to go out sometimes and like go into town and get stuff, and they were not allowed to speak to anyone unless they were given permission by their father. Their every move was controlled by Robert. And the beatings just got worse and worse as the years passed by. He would beat the kids with 2x4s, with whips, his fists. And remember, Robert was a trained fighter when he was younger. He was a really strong guy. So the beatings were absolutely brutal. Robert would also lock the kids outside and force them to sleep in the snow if he got really, really angry with them. He would also threaten to toss them out of the family. And at this point, they were all convinced that they were the only true Christians in the world. And if they were tossed out of the family, they were never going to get to heaven. But things only get worse from here. By the time Alisha was 19, Robert had decided that she would become his second wife. He would force Alisha to get into the bathtub with him, and he started molesting her. And eventually this turned into full-on rape. He would tell her to go to bed with no underwear on and to wait for him until Rose fell asleep, and then he would rape Alisha. And if she ever put up any resistance, Robert would tell her that she was going to hell because she was going against the will of God. And if she didn't give in, she would never get into heaven. He would force Alisha to go on drives with him, and he would rape her in the car. Alisha was also made to sleep in the same bed with her mother and her father. Robert would lay in the middle, and then Alisha would be on one side of him and Rose would be on the other side. And he started telling Alisha that Rose was old and ugly and he wasn't attracted to her anymore, so he needed Alisha to sexually arouse him so that he could impregnate Rose to keep the family growing. So he would turn over and sexually assault his daughter to get himself right up to the point of like climax. Then he would turn over to the other side and finish with Rose. And when Alisha told Robert that she didn't want to do this, he would say that he needed her to help him perform sexually with Rose so they could make more babies. And if she didn't comply, then it would be as if she was killing babies. If she didn't help him, then no babies could be created, so she might as well be killing babies. And Rose absolutely hated this as well. She was not okay with this at all, but she was so far under Robert's control. To me, it seems like she just was defeated. She felt totally helpless against Robert. And Robert would tell the other kids that Alisha was their new mom. Like, he was full on trying to replace Rose with his own daughter. And this almost destroyed Alisha's relationship with her mother. There was like this weird tension between them. Then in the late 90s, Robert decided to move the family to Alaska, the last frontier, where he and his family could really live in total isolation. People had started building homes closer and closer to their property in New Mexico, and that meant that more eyes were on the Hale family, and the new neighbors were seeing some pretty alarming signs from the Hales, and they threatened to send a letter to Jack Nicholson to request that the Hales be evicted. But before that could happen, Robert decided to pack up his family and they headed for Alaska. And this trip took several days because they were driving, and New Mexico is a very far drive from Alaska. Their car would also break down like constantly on this trip, so that would just delay them. So this journey from New Mexico to Alaska took quite a while. And during the drive to Alaska, Robert would stop at laundromats along the way, and these laundromats would have showers that you could like put a coin in and you could take a shower. And this is where Robert would secretly rape and beat Alisha. They would pull into these laundromats. Robert would tell everyone to stay in the car because he was going to go in and take a shower, and he would tell Alisha that he needed her help with something. He would then bring her into the shower and brutally rape her. And this happened multiple times along the way. And during one of these stops, Robert beat Alisha so brutally in the shower that she lost consciousness. And after the Hale family reached Alaska, they lived in a few different areas before they finally found the perfect spot. There was an old camp located in the valley within the Wrangell St. Elias National Park, and they called their new home Hillbilly Heaven. And this place was very secluded. They were so isolated in this new place, much more isolated than they had been in New Mexico. Hillbilly Heaven was located about 15 miles from the tiny town of McCarthy, and at first, the residents of McCarthy really liked the Hale family. They appeared to be this big, happy, slightly eccentric, very religious, pioneer type of family. And I haven't mentioned this yet, but most of the kids played an instrument. Like they had their own little family band, and they would play these folksy, charming songs, and Robert had the kids perform for the locals, and they absolutely loved it. They had made a really good first impression on the people of McCarthy, but that would all eventually change. So once the family moved to Hillbilly Heaven, the abuse did not stop. If anything, it got worse because they were now even further removed from society. There was less of a risk for someone on the outside to see the bruises that Robert left on his children. And if the locals ever did see bruises on the kids, they would usually chalk it up to them living off the land and being really, rugged kids. The type of work that they had to do on their property, it was really hard work, and they were bound to get a little banged up. They had no idea that these kids were being tortured and beaten by their father. Now, in the spring of 2003, Robert made the decision to bulldoze some of the trees in the national park to make it easier for he and his family to get into town. Remember, their property is in the middle of the national park. And so instead of asking permission, Robert just decided to get a bulldozer and start tearing down trees. Eventually, word of this made its way to the park rangers, and they were not happy. This ended up turning into a huge fight over land rights. The media got involved, and not just American media. This made international news, mostly because people were so intrigued by the Hale family and their odd pioneer way of life. They had no electricity. They used generators, but they didn't have like any proper electricity. They didn't have running water. They lived off the land in the middle of this big national forest in one of the harshest environments in the world. And the fact that there were so many kids in the family really interested people. They wanted to know more about this pioneer family and the man that they knew as Papa Pilgrim. Reporters suddenly started showing up in McCarthy, a place that rarely got any visitors at all. And suddenly they had journalists from CNN and the BBC wanting to know more about Papa Pilgrim and his family. And oddly enough, Robert actually spoke to the reporters. I mean, I guess it's not that odd because we know he loves attention and he loves himself, but he was always telling his kids that TV was evil and outsiders were evil, but he was willing to give these interviews. And people were really captivated by this kind of out there rugged family living like it's the 1800s in the Alaskan frontier. They had no idea the nightmare that these kids were living day in and day out. And Robert even started beating up on the younger members of the family. The youngest of the 15 was a little boy named Jonathan, and Robert was so terrible to this little boy. He was only a toddler when Robert started torturing and beating him. If Jonathan would cry, Robert would pinch his nose closed and he would put his hand over Jonathan's mouth to cut off his oxygen supply, and he would not let up until Jonathan turned blue and fainted. And the other kids would be freaking out while this was happening. They were horrified at what Robert was doing to Jonathan, and so Robert started using the abuse of Jonathan as a way to keep the other kids in line. Like, to punish the other kids, he would suffocate Jonathan in front of them until he would pass out. He would also throw Jonathan outside in the snow if he would cry too much, and then he would kick him and punch him, and he was only 2 years old. But then in 2005, Robert's twisted world would start to crumble. It all started when he he gave Alisha the worst beating she had ever had. Alisha was 29 at this point, and she had been sexually assaulted on pretty much a daily basis for 10 years, and she was just mentally and physically done. Robert had recently started talking to her about having his children. He wanted to start impregnating Alisha instead of Rose, and that was kind of Alicia's breaking point. She could not stand the thought of having to bear her father's children. The family had also become acquainted with another large family living nearby in a different town. They were the Buckinghams, and the kids saw how the Buckingham father treated his wife and his children, and it was so different from the way Robert treated his wife and his children. And when they met the Buckinghams, some of the kids really started to question some of the things that Robert had been telling them over the years. And Alisha had really been questioning things. She never fully understood why her father was sexually abusing her. She never fully bought into his justification of why this was supposedly okay. So one day, Robert took Alisha to this little abandoned cabin that his family would sometimes use, and he repeatedly raped her in this cabin. And Robert had somehow acquired a digital camera, and he would use this camera to take photos and videos of Alisha naked, performing various sex acts. He would also force her to dance naked for him while he filmed her. And on this particular day, Alisha decided to speak up, and she confronted her father about the sexual abuse. She told him that she does not understand why God would want them to have this type of relationship. She said, "I'm not your wife, I'm your daughter, and I feel like this is wrong. I feel like God wouldn't want this to happen." And this sent Robert into a rage, and he beat Alisha so badly that she truly thought she was going to die that day. He beat her in her face, her head, her neck, her shoulders, her chest, and Alisha eventually lost consciousness. And when she woke up, her father was raping her. Then once he was done raping her, he forced Alisha to get up and dance for him while he filmed her. He had beaten Alisha so violently that she was unrecognizable. They stayed in that cabin for 3 days to keep Alisha hidden from the people in town, but Alisha was able to eventually talk him into going back home to Hillbilly Heaven so they could be with the family. But he made Alisha wear a ski mask to cover her wounds so that her brothers and sisters and her mother couldn't see what he had done to her. But as soon as she arrived home, her siblings demanded that she remove the mask so they could see what Robert had done to her. So she did. She removed the mask, and they were horrified. And while Robert and Alisha had been gone for those few days at the cabin, it gave the rest of the family time to talk about some of the things that had been going on, about all the sexual abuse that had been going on with Alisha, about how violent Robert was becoming. He had always been a violent person. He had always beaten the children, but it was getting to a point where they really thought that he was going to end up killing someone. And when they saw Alisha's face, it just ignited something in her brothers, and they confronted Robert. They told him that he was wrong for what he was doing. He was sinful, and what he was doing to his children needed to stop. And this did not go over well, as you can probably imagine. Robert ended up punching one of his boys, which prompted the boys to devise a plan to escape in the middle of the night, and that's exactly what they did. So once the older 5 boys escaped, things got even worse in the house. Robert was growing more and more unhinged in his abuse, in his fanatically religious beliefs, and Alisha knew that if she did not figure out a way to escape, she was going to die. So one day in March of 2005, Robert told the family that he was going to go into town on the snowmobile and get some fuel for the generator, and he would be right back. And Alisha knew that this was her chance. She and her 16-year-old sister Jerusalem quickly packed some supplies, some food. They hopped onto another one of the family's snowmobiles and they took off. But the problem was there was only one path into and out of Hillbilly Heaven, and they knew that their father would be coming back home on that same path. So they drove down the path a bit, and then they got off the road and onto an embankment near the river, and they covered their snowmobile with a white sheet, and then they covered themselves up with another white sheet so they would be camouflaged with the snow. And they laid there in the freezing cold and waited for the sound of their father's snowmobile to pass. And eventually they heard him pass, and they knew they had to act fast because once he got home, he would immediately realize that they were missing. They started driving, and they eventually found a phone. They called one of their brothers that lived in another town at this point, one of the ones that had escaped. They told their brothers that they had escaped and that they needed them to come pick them up. But somehow the plan got mixed up. The brothers were looking all over the area for them, but they couldn't find them. So Alisha and Jerusalem ended up spending 4 or 5 days in the wilderness in 20 below zero weather. They found this tree and they just kind of camped out under this tree. They ate snow for water. They lived off of like acorns and berries and like raisins and stuff. And while they were hiding under this tree, they could hear Robert's snowmobile at all hours of the day and night. And he was obviously searching all over for them. And eventually, finally, their brothers found them. Alisha and her sister Jerusalem went to go stay with the Buckingham family, and after spending a couple of months with the Buckinghams, Alisha finally decided that it was time to go to the authorities and tell them what had been happening. So Alisha goes to the authorities and she told them the truth. She told them everything, and they could not believe the horrific things that she was saying. They ended up having her retell the story to a grand jury, and Alisha said that she kept her head down pretty much the entire time she was telling her story, and after she was done, she looked up and nearly every person in that room was crying. Alisha found out that after she and Jerusalem had escaped, Robert beat 2-year-old Jonathan so badly that they didn't know if he was going to make it. Rose actually did step in and she stopped Robert, which probably saved Jonathan's life, and she actually told Robert that he needed to leave, and he did. I think that Robert knew that everything was crumbling. His older children had left. He was losing control. Everything was falling apart. This disgusting, twisted, evil world that he had created where he was the Lord and master and center of everything, it was all coming to an end, and he knew it. So when Rose told him to leave, he didn't even fight it, and he left. The grand jury made the decision to charge Robert with 30 felony charges of sexual assault, kidnapping, and incest. But now they had to find him. They didn't know where he was. After Rose kicked him out, they didn't know where he went. So for 2 weeks, there was a full-on manhunt going on in Alaska. After a 2-week manhunt, Papa Pilgrim was finally found and arrested. Robert ended up taking a plea deal, and he ended up pleading guilty to all of the charges. And in November of 2007, he was given a 14-year prison sentence. And during the sentencing, the family members were able to confront Robert. They were able to finally tell him about the horrific impact that he had made on their lives. And they were finally able to speak up, something they had never been allowed to do. Several of the children, even the younger ones, gave impact statements, and they addressed their father directly. They talked in detail about the abuse.
Laura, it was the abuse his family says Robert Hale put them through that made up the emotional testimony today at Hale's sentencing.
CBS 11's Andrea Augusti was in that courtroom today. She joins us now live in the newsroom with these latest details tonight. Andrea.
Dave and Laura, it was a life of abuse. That's what victims of the man known as Papa Pilgrim said in court today, speaking out for the very first time at his sentencing. Now, we want to warn you, the testimony you're about to hear is disturbing.
Our family lived a two-secret life. On the outside, we looked quaint and could be quite charming when it suited us. But behind closed doors, a battle was always raging.
According to Robert Hale's wife, Karina, the battle went on for 30 years, a time when she and her children were tormented both physically and mentally by the man they knew as Papa Pilgrim.
You took for yourself the very things that I held so dear. You knew I wanted so badly to be pure.
The youngest Hale children broke their silence as well, giving their testimony in the form of letters to their father. Because they are so young, we have protected their identities.
I knew I looked very tough on the outside, even though you cannot see it. I am very soft on the inside. I have feelings and am hurt inside because of the things you did.
Robert Hale pled no contest to 30 counts of sexual abuse, incest, kidnapping, and coercion, for years of physically abusing his children and sleeping with his daughters.
I did not know when I was a little girl that you did not act properly with us girls. You always told us everything you did was proper. I know now that it was not proper for you to sleep with me and hold me close without your pants on. It makes me sad that you did these kind of things. I hope you will ask Jesus to forgive you. I have asked him to forgive me, and he did.
People didn't know the details about this case, but when the children read their impact statements and they gave specific details about all of the abuse that they had suffered for years and years, all of Robert's secrets were finally out. And when it was finally Robert's turn to speak and address Rose and the kids, he spoke for hours, basically telling his entire life story. He never took responsibility. He never admitted to anything. In fact, he denied ever even so much as spanking his children. When he arrived in prison, he was given a medical examination. You know, he and his family, they never went to the doctor. They discovered that he had advanced diabetes. He also had lots of blood clots in his legs, and all of it had gone unchecked for who knows how long. And so the doctors gave Robert only 6 months to live. Robert Allen Hale died in the summer of 2008, only 8 months after his prison sentence started. And that was the story of Papa Pilgrim. Let me know what you guys think about this one down in the comments. Don't forget, if you want to try out Wild, that link is in the description box. Just use my code Sommer Sanchez at checkout. If you find this type of content interesting, please consider subscribing and liking this video and leaving a comment. That is the easiest way for you guys to help support me and my channel. And as always, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I will see you next time.